Hello, my name is Stella Pachidi. I'm a lecturer in information systems at the Judge Business School in the University of Cambridge. And my research is mainly in the area of technology, work, and organizing. I'm very excited to be part of this PDW, and I'm really looking forward to the live interactions with the organizers, the other panelists, as well as the participants next week. In this presentation, I will be briefly presenting the perspective that I'm going to bring on the PDW, and that's specifically focused on algorithmic technologies from a knowing perspective, and specifically a regime of knowing perspective. So, sorry about that. So in my work, I have been studying mainly how various algorithmic technologies like data analytics and artificial intelligence technologies are implemented in the organizations, focusing on the work practices of people and looking at how the nature of work changes with implementation of those technologies. And what I find particularly important is by focusing on the work practices, obviously looking at knowing and how knowing, the way in which knowing emerges in those work practices may change with the implementation of those technologies. Why do I think that algorithmic technologies are particularly interesting to study from a knowing perspective? So algorithmic technologies, by definition almost, they represent knowledge as the outcome of algorithmic transformations of decontextualized, digitized, and quantified information. When you implement an algorithmic technology, usually the technology practitioners that are associated with the technology, this is how they view knowledge, and this is sort of their paradigm. But further than that, the algorithms themselves, they enter the workplace with built-in paradigms that may shift what counts as valuable information and how it is produced. This is because, for example, algorithms can only process digital data, so data that can be digitized. So by default, for example, the attention will be to objects that can be digitized, objects that can be quantified, and generally things that can be captured in the types of digital data that the algorithm is designed to process. Another interesting thing is that usually when you implement an algorithmic technology in the workplace, you see the practitioners, they expect that they will increase objectivity in the decision-making processes that the algorithms are supposed to automate, or at least to support. Why is that? Because we tend to assume that the digital data that are processed, that this digital data is hard facts without thinking of the context through which this data was extracted, the context even in which the data was generated, was produced on the first place. And also similarly, we tend to think that quantitative models that the algorithms run are objective as well, without actually realizing that it's humans behind the generation of data, the selection that of the data that the algorithm processes, and even the decision criteria that the algorithm uses for when it processes the data and produces certain outcomes that are supposed to inform decision-making processes. And because of that, because there are certain decision criteria, there are certain values almost imbued in those algorithms, it is understandable that those algorithms, they basically promote distinct valuation schemes for assessing objects, people, and actions. So, for example, in TripAdvisor, we see the way in which hotels evaluated has fundamentally shifted since the TripAdvisor technology emerged, which was quite, had quite different standards, quite different ways for ranking and assessing the quality of the hotels compared to the AA, which was the old way of evaluating hotels. But also what is quite interesting is that quite often we don't fully understand the design choices of those algorithms. We don't fully understand the values that are imbued in those algorithms because they are supposed to run automatically. So all those design choices, when it comes to data, as well as when it comes to valuation processes, decision-making processes, etc., whatever the algorithm does, all these things are black boxed mainly. However, and another thing that is important also has to do with the technology practitioners that enter the workplace together with those algorithms. So obviously, in order to implement those algorithms, you need people who have specific expertise in writing the algorithms and processing the large amounts of data. And usually this expertise cannot be found in the existing workforce of the organization. So what is also particularly interesting from a knowledge and work perspective is the fact that there's new professionals entering the workforce whose expertise matters increasingly, and thus managers and other employees have to rely on them and on their expertise in order to get those algorithms in place and working. Taking all these into consideration, me and colleagues, including Hans Buurens and Marleen Huisman from the Keen Research Group at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, as well as Samar Faraj from McGill University, we have developed a regime of knowing perspective, which we suggest that is quite useful to make better sense of those changes that take place in the workplace with the introduction of algorithmic technologies. A regime of knowing basically guides what is worth knowing, what actions matter to acquire this knowledge, and who has the authority to make decisions around those issues. We distinguish three aspects of a regime of knowing. And by the way, I should mention that we discuss this perspective in a paper that is forthcoming in Organization Science. As I said, regimes of knowing are instantiated through knowing practices. By knowing practices, we refer to the situated activities through which actors come to know what they need to know in order to proficiently perform their work. Actors who work under the same regime of knowing, they perform similar knowing practices. Therefore, they tend to pay attention to similar objects and types of information and share distinct methods for generating knowledge claims. And knowing practices are intertwined with specific valuation schemes that orient actors to what is worth knowing and what is proper action to produce valuable knowledge. Thus, valuation schemes determine what kind of information matters and what methods are important to acquire value from this information. And both knowing practices and valuation schemes are also deeply entwined with the existing authority arrangements in a regime of knowing. Authority arrangements refer to socially sanctioned ways to organize, affording power to actors whose expertise is highly valued to impact how they and others engage in the work. So as I said, this regime of knowing perspective comes from our paper, and that's an empirical paper. So I will give you a bit of a background about how we applied this perspective. That was by performing a qualitative longitudinal study in telco sales medium. So that was a sales department of a telecom organization where they treated small to medium enterprises as their customers. This was basically part of my PhD research a few years ago. So I spent 2 years studying the introduction of an algorithmic technology in telco sales medium, and specifically studying the struggle that unfolded between the sales account managers and the data scientists who introduced the algorithmic technology and in the organization. So the struggle brought incommensurate views to the surface concerning the appropriateness of different knowing practices. So to give you an example, the data scientists, they entered the workplace thinking that they would substantially improve the way of working of account managers, and specifically the way in which they knew their business customers and they identified sales opportunities for them. So, for example, one data scientist said, "I don't think that they know all the 300 customers that well. Our model helps them contact the right customer at the right time and with the right offer." Obviously this view of the data scientist that you needed to process a lot of hard facts, a lot of data with algorithmic technology in order to produce, in order to identify sales opportunities, it was not shared. It was by the account managers. It was actually quite orthogonal to their own views. So the account manager would say, the account managers would say, for example, that the model is extracted from data. It is always an assumption, and I speak to the customer so I can feel if this customer has potential or not. So in those 2 years of studying this, the interactions between data scientists and account managers, and obviously the account managers with the algorithmic technology, we were able to analyze how the regime of knowing evolved in the workplace through this struggle. So the outcome of the struggle between the sales account managers and the data scientists actually resulted in a radical change in the sales regime of knowing. From one focused on the deep understanding of customers via personal contact and strong relationships, to one based upon model predictions from the processing of large data sets. It is interesting to note, though, that this struggle often took place behind the scenes through symbolic actions. The incumbent sales workers, they avoided using the introduced technology as it was associated with ways of knowing that were orthogonal to how they constructed and used knowledge, which was basically via the personal contact with the customer, using their intuition and experience, focusing on the personal and trustworthy relationship with the customer, and always staying on top of the sales process, being the main person controlling the sales process because they had the relationship with the customer. Since their knowing practices were quite orthogonal to the algorithmic knowing that was associated with the introduced algorithmic technology, which assumed that knowledge should be generated through algorithmic processing of large data sets, the idea that you need to act upon the algorithmic outcomes if you want to act rationally and as efficiently as possible, and obviously which would increase the authority of the data scientists, because the data scientists had the expertise to develop the algorithms, to process the data, etc. So those fundamental differences led the sales account managers to resort to symbolic conformity. The symbolic conformity entailed that they pretended to comply with the suggested changes, and they pretended to use the technology for identifying sales opportunities. And in this way, via conforming symbolically, they thought that they could defend and maintain their existing knowing practices. Similarly, the data scientists enacted symbolic advocacy by hiding the account manager's limited use of the data-enabled ways. So, so the data scientists, they didn't fully verify to what extent the algorithmic technology was actually used by the account managers. However, they proclaimed the new approach as a great success, and as you can read in the paper, which I think is also shared on the platform, you can actually see that the data scientists made several presentations to telco and specifically to higher management to show how successful sales was with the analytics, with the algorithmic technology. However, what is interesting is that those different types of symbolic actions, the symbolic conformity and the symbolic advocacy, they enriched each other and contributed to making the technology appear effective in the eyes of management. And eventually this led to a full implementation of the technology, which eventually led to rendering the account managers redundant. So I had the awkward moment to actually observe those people appearing to be obsolete and eventually losing their jobs. In order to conclude, what we find interesting with this regime of knowing perspective is that it actually helps see below the surface of struggles over changing established practices with introduction of algorithmic technologies. The regime of knowing lens shifts attention to the deeper challenges that actors are faced with, such as disputing what is worth knowing, what actions matter to acquire this knowledge, and who has the authority to make decisions around those issues. Thus, the regime of knowing perspective can be a useful tool in the quest for answering research questions related to how such emerging technologies influence attitudes and behaviors in the workplace, how they affect power structures, and how they become associated with altered work content and processes. By approaching knowing practices as entwined with valuation schemes and authority arrangements, the regime of knowing lens also helps understand why symbolic actions meant to defend and maintain knowing practices, something that we often see in the workplace, why such symbolic actions may have unintended consequences for the actors who perform them, and thus can reinforce the change rather than avoid it as what the initial intention is. One final observation from our study is that whereas symbolic actions are generally viewed as a safety valve to maintain actors' idiosyncratic ways of working, our study offers a different view according to which symbolic actions may work against the actor's intentions and yield dramatic consequences that extend beyond their control. I will conclude here, but I'm really looking forward to engaging with the panelists as well as with the participants in an interactive discussion about all those issues next week. Thank you very much.